professionally studied the Middle East for almost 40 years. I've never, and I go far, this is true, I go back far enough that we used to sit around seminars with, I don't know what to say, certain professors who had views I didn't like, but were really good guys and gentlemen. And we would laugh uproariously at Edward Said's book. So I've come a long way, in the wrong direction perhaps. But I just want to say this. It's really important not to know just what side you are on or what you think, but to have a real understanding of these issues and the specifics of these issues, because if you're going to be persuasive, you really have to know your stuff. And if you're really going to look ahead and understand what direction things are heading in, you're going to have to know your stuff. So I really want to stress that, and I think it's does honor for you, not only for me but for you, that you came today because you wanted to talk more about this and not just the latest headline in Egypt. I want to divide my talk very briefly into 4 parts. The first part is, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm coming off at Gettysburg. I had a very bad cough and cold, so please forgive me if I'm difficult to understand certain points. I have never seen a crisis as badly understood as this one by both sides. It is unbelievable. I mean that the head of U.S. intelligence could testify that the Muslim Brotherhood is a moderate group and has very little to do with religion. He should have looked at the briefing and said, wait a minute, that's not right. I've never seen a case where there's such ignorance. Now look, there have been many international issues, controversies, debates, the invasion of Iraq, the September 11th, the many examples. I should bring in non-Middle East examples. But here, people cannot debate. If you know the Passover Seder, they don't even know how to ask questions. And let me give 3 illustrations of that. I already gave one. In early November 2010, I wrote a column entitled, "The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood has declared jihad on America. Will anyone in America notice?" And then a little while later, a friend called me up and said, no, they haven't noticed. In October, the new head of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Abadi, gave a speech. And I said to myself, this speech is different from the tone and politics of everything that's been said before. In the mid-1950s, the Muslim Brotherhood were rounded up by the army and were actually sent to concentration camps. They were tortured. Some of them were hung. It's interesting to see how much things change. And that was a joke, but you don't have to laugh. And they were traumatized by this experience. They were scared of the government and of the military and of whichever of the 3 dictators were in power. And when Badi says openly, publicly, that America is weak, we don't have to worry about them, they're in full retreat. The Mubarak government is weak, and therefore now is the time to move and declare jihad. And not one mass media publication, not one academic covered this. But it was a clear switch leading toward the revolution 4 months later. That was important, and you cannot miss important signals like that and do your job, okay? That's very, very important. The second example I want to give is, again, it's a parallel type of example. Oh, let me just say one thing. It was clear that Mubarak's government was in trouble. It was clear that and this is what happened in the French Revolution, that the ruling elite was dissatisfied with the regime. If you do a comparison between Bashar al-Assad in Syria and Mubarak. Bashar al-Assad prepared for his transition. Mubarak refused. He refused to stand down, and he picked his son. And I want to tell you, I mean, the people in the elite in the army hated this kid. He hated him. I mean, people would call him the boy. People at high-level meetings that he addressed would fall asleep. It was serious. And I'll tell you, we can't be off the record, can we? Okay. If I would say off the record, it was clear that members of the Egyptian ruling elite talked openly about this. And this was not known. And then it was clear that when the crisis came, the key point of the crisis is that the elite would not protect the regime. They wanted the regime to fall because they had lost confidence in Mubarak and they had lost confidence in, well, they never had confidence in his son. Another point, very briefly. The day after the Syrian National Congress was named, and this Congress was organized, you can see that the details are important here, was organized by Turkey. Of course, if you have an Islamist regime, you turn over U.S. policy to them in Syria. And, of course, as I said, with the U.S. They gave the names of the 21 people, I think, that were going to be on the leadership. Well, what happened? All you had to do was take those names and read them, and with some consultations with Syrian oppositionists and with some research, I mean, I took 2 hours to see that 55–60% of the names were Muslim Brotherhood people. And then after I published my article, a Syrian friend, I think the best informed person in this country on this, said, well, actually, you missed 2 because 2 of the people who are nominally leftists are also Muslim Brotherhood satellites. Didn't this become known? Why did it take, I think, 9 months? And by the way, and the Kurds were very unhappy with this. Why did it take 9 or 10 months for the New York Times to get this story when they just said, we're walking out, we're going to destroy this organization? This is not serious. And this crisis, if I may refer to the last 2 years, has been characterized by this. You have a letter written, the New York Times, by the son of, I could say the son of the head of the Geneva Office of the Muslim Brotherhood, the one who was teaching. Thank you. He wrote a letter in the New York Times. I'm not making this up. He said the Muslim Brotherhood was a pro-British organization which hated the fascists and supported parliamentary government. So I wrote the New York Times a little letter, I hadn't keep it short, saying, as I'm typing this, I'm holding in my hand, and I actually held it in my hand, the receipts from the Nazi government that the Muslim Brotherhood gave them in 1939. It's ridiculous. It's just flatly untrue. And the New York Times never, I don't know where the academics were, because there are a lot of people who knew that. This is the Alice in Wonderland world that we have entered in. It's not just bad policy. It's that the debate has descended to a level of ignorance when people in the American policy-making and decision-making elite don't know anything about these issues. I've never seen that before to this extent. This is important. The second question is, what are the characteristics of this new era that we have entered into, a new era after the end of July 22nd, 23rd, 1952, the beginning of the last era, which was the last coup in Egypt and the original coming to power of Gamal Abdel Nasser and the rise of Arab nationalism. From 1952 to recently. The Middle East politics were dominated by Arab nationalism. There's a lot more that can be said about that. That's over. Now we have a new era, the era of Islamism, or at least the era in which Islamism is going to struggle with several forces, with moderate Democrats, with the smallest of these forces, with conservative traditionalists, and including the army, of course, and the third group, of course, are the Islamists who are competing with these two forces. I think that this is going to continue for 30 or 40 years, or even 50 years. It's not going to go away quickly. Now, what are the characteristics of this new era? Number one, the effort of a doctrine, political Islamism, to gain control of the Middle East in as many countries as possible. This is at least the fourth radical challenge that has been faced: Nazism, communism, and Arab nationalism. And I would actually include another one, the third world radical dictatorships. That's it. That's the centrality of it. The centrality of it is not the transition to moderate democracy. It's the struggle of Islamism to seize state power. That's another point. Number two, this is not a religious phenomenon, not a mystical phenomenon. It's what revolutionary movements have always tried to do, to seize state power. And that you have to demystify this. It's really, in many ways, things that we've seen before. The third principle is that because of this religionization process, the problem is that Islam is divided among Sunnis and Shias. And so the third feature is a tremendous, and we saw this beginning with Iraq, the tremendous importance of the Sunni-Shia conflict, which I'd love to have time to talk about later. This is a central characteristic of this period of time. A fourth factor is, I should say that the problem for the Sunni side is, are the Islamists and the non-Islamists on the Sunni side going to work together, just as the Jordanians and the Saudis and others gave money to Al-Qaeda and others for Iraq, because the key thing was to defeat the Shia, represented, of course, under Iranian leadership. Very briefly, amazing things are happening. The Muslim Brotherhood think tank issued a 71-page report which said the Shia are greater dangers than the United States and Israel. We have to think about these things strategically, take them into account. Two leaders of Hamas, two high-ranking leaders, have said in the last week or two that the struggle in Syria is more important than the struggle in Palestine. Don't see things in a permanent way. You have to adjust your thinking as we move forward. Things are changing, even though they may be changing according to an old framework. But there are a lot of new phenomena which we have to deal with. Another point is, and it's funny because I wrote this a couple of days ago, and I said, the Israel card is dead in Arab politics. Now, of course, it's not dead because we'll still use it. Anyone who believes in linkage has a ridiculous distance to cross. Israel is not important. I mean, in the battle within the Middle East, it's important on how it weighs in as a factor. An Arab dictator cannot just go and say, well, actually, a very famous Egyptian statement, which was something like, all voices must be silenced before the din of battle. In other words, don't you know there's a war on? We have to fight Israel, so you shut up, don't complain, and don't bring up social issues and so on. This is not real anymore. And remember that even for Turkey and Iran, when they wanted to try to capture Arab support, and they would say, Israel, 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 but they can't do it anymore in an effective way because the other Arabs will, the Arabs will say, in the case of Iran, Shia, 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 and in the case of Turkey, not Turk, Turk, Turk. So these things are changing. Now, I'm not going to talk much about it, but I'll say all these things, all these challenges are, of course, in the context of no American leadership. And we can talk more about that, but that has a lot of effects. People in the Middle East know they're on their own. I mean, whether I like them or not, the Syrian, somebody just told me about their conversation with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood leaders about stuff I've written, which they agreed with. And one of the things they agreed with is they don't trust the United States. They think the United States is weak because they want to get arms from the United States. So this raises the question, what would an effective strategy look like? And it's really simple in general terms. It's to organize a united front of all the, not just anti-Islamists, but non-Islamist forces, whether they be conservative traditionalist Muslims, whether they be liberal Arabs, or Turks, or Iranians, or Kurds, and of course, to start treating Israel as a real ally, not just, yes, our support for Israel is undying, and it will never go away, and it will never decrease 1%, 1/10 of 1%, but to actually comprehend the strategic asset which was understood back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, that the role can play. That's the solution. And to bring in the Europeans and to bring in Moroccans and the Algerians and others, it's not impossible. People have been yearning for it. I think they've given up on it about now. I mean, but in fact, one final interesting, how many minutes do we have?
You're about out of time.
Good, I'm about finished. One interesting example is this. The police chief of Dubai, of the United Arab Emirates, who's a very respected person, a very smart guy, he gave a speech at a recent Gulf Security Conference. He said, I want to talk about 46 threats to the Gulf states. The number one threat on my list may surprise you. It's the threat of the United States. Because we cannot depend on them, we cannot depend on them to fight Iran, and so on and so forth. This is significant. And people know it, I assure you. They know it. Now, I'm out of time. I would be happy, I hope to address very specific discussion points of what will happen in Syria and what will happen in Egypt. I actually have answers. If you're interested, though, bear in mind that in the 1990s, no one's ever referred to it yet. In the 1990s, there was an Islamist insurgency in Egypt, and we have to look at what happened then, which we can talk about. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Let me ask you a quick question, if I may. Why don't you stay up there if you don't mind, Barry?
Oh, sure.
Just because we've got the camera on there. One of the things you led off with, and of course sort of alluded to throughout, was the degree to which the Obama administration seems not to understand the character of the Muslim Brotherhood. I wonder if you might speak to the extent to which they actually have embraced the Muslim Brotherhood, okay, including in their own circles.
Well, first of all, I want to be honest and say that I think that people on the other side have done a very bad job, and not because their instincts aren't good, and the present company not included, and Mr. Coughlin there too, but they're just so many superficial analyses, and then they are used to discredit the rest. I think that what the Obama administration has followed is what I call the Brennan Doctrine, and the Brennan Doctrine. And I want to tell you something. This was clearly defined. People talked. I mean, people before Obama was elected, people at State and people at Defense were very much aware of, and were debating it. It was that the following, and honestly, I mean, for my personal purposes, I think I understand exactly what Obama policy is. It's like this. Number one, the worst thing that ever happened or could happen, or a terrible crisis, really serious danger, is September 11th. And they're approaching it from a counter-terrorist point of view. Number two, we don't want September 11th or or anti-American terrorism to happen again. Number 3, how can we prevent that? Number 4, because if we get the Islamists to like us, and by the way, I realized in the sense that there's a parallelism between the Middle East policy and a lot of arguments about immigration. If you get people to like you, they will be nice to you and support you. Well, it depends. So, first of all, the Islamists will not attack you anymore. And secondly of all, the Muslim Brotherhood will be moderated by being in power, which is, of course, exactly what we heard about Arafat. I don't understand where the sense of history is here. And number 3, they will suppress the Salafists and Al-Qaeda. And therefore, we will have a friendly Muslim Brotherhood leadership because, after all, the Muslim Brotherhood is on the right side of history. If you look at the Cairo speech of President Obama, you see very clearly this theme that this, and in a sense, he was very accurate. The era of nationalism is over in the Middle East, in the Arab world. Now comes the era of Islamism. They're very, I mean, you don't need a conspiracy, you don't need this, it's very clear. They think they have a great idea and they're going to succeed brilliantly. But of course, there are problems, and they won't accept. They won't accept. I mean, look at the U.S. has an ally, the unrepentant Nazi collaborators. And by the way, the new book called Nazis, Islamists, and the Making of the Modern Middle East, we have CIA documents. We have a huge amount of stuff that come out from Yale in December. We will prove this history. Unrepentant Nazi collaborator. I'll get to that. Okay. Want to make women chattel. Want to kill gays. Want to commit genocide and hate Christians. And this is, the U.S. is allied with this. Is allied. And how people don't say, my goodness, how can this possibly happen? I don't understand it. I don't understand how everybody from every ideological viewpoint doesn't say, are these the people we want to work with? Are these the people we want to put in control, in some cases, of society or give money to? It's just mind-boggling for me that this could happen. But I really want to say, I think it's a really coherent, well-thought-out policy. And I don't know if you... last week I found an amazing quote from 2 senior National Security Council people. They weren't named, but it would be easy to find out. And here's what they said. We must support, that we must help the Muslim, we must support at least somewhat the Muslim Brotherhood people in Egypt, because fighting them will not work. You can't beat them, which, by the way, relates interestingly to historically arguments that were made by Israel. And then they said, and if they get mad, they are going to turn to terrorism and attack us. And consider the implications of that this means that the United States is held hostage. So if we don't do what they want to, then they're going to attack us. So we have to do what they want to. I mean, I wrote a history of American foreign policy from George Washington, and I cannot imagine anything like this ever happening before in American history. But mind you, I want to stress and underline this. There is a clear policy. People know what the policy is. It's very much thought out. This is not just such a mess that, or just something that just happened. They think they're doing great work.
Thank you. Dan?
I know we don't have time for this, but I'd just like, as a participant, could you please compare and contrast the 1863 Battle of Gettysburg receiving Pickett's charge with the one you just went through?
I'd be delighted to...
we don't have
it's the second one I just went. I'd be delighted to talk to you about it afterward.
My real question is...
I'd be really delighted.
He's a reenactor, so... my real question is, everyone's been talking about...
By the way, may I point out that the Confederacy, forgive me for southern neighborhoods here, but the Confederacy was illegally elected. Well, depending on how you view the Constitution, it doesn't say you can't secede, I don't think. They were legally and democratically elected, and by the state legislatures. So would anybody give a thought to supporting it? Okay, go ahead. Not
I'll ask Senator Paul.
Better react.
The Muslim Brotherhood allies in Syria 6 months ago were thought to be almost inevitably on the road to victory.
I know.
And now they're not. What's the real story about
First, one of my articles, I pointed out that 3 weeks before the day I wrote the article, the headlines in the New York Times were how they were about to win. And then 3 weeks later, it was how they were about to lose. Now, I do not want to make this charge lightly, but I think people were maneuvered. That certain government wanted to, because the red line had been crossed, that is the use of nerve gas, that they wanted to build a certain hysteria that they're about to lose. And then what happens? This is why I don't understand that people don't reflect on this stuff and say, oh, wow, I just realized this. What, 3 weeks later, the tide turned, and then nobody mentioned, wait a minute, we were told that they were about to lose, and the fact is that even during the period when it was said that they were about to be defeated, there were still advances by the rebels in the north. Now, just very briefly, our estimates are that there are about 6,000 al-Qaeda people. There are about 30,000 people who are roughly Muslim Brotherhood. Not all of them are affiliated. It's very much looser in Syria. And we have about 12,000 people who are Salafists. The Free Syrian Army consists of about 300 officers who basically, deserted the Syrian government in Turkey, and 15,000, 20,000 Muslim Brotherhood fighters in Syria. The FSA was not intended to be such. And they're really, again, here's the absence of American leadership, which maybe could have produced a different kind of FSA. But the fact is that those arms are going directly to the Muslim Brotherhood. And as my esteemed colleague Philip Smythe, if you saw his interview in the USA Today, pointed out that we now even have evidence that al-Qaeda, in fact, if you've never seen a very good blog called Brown Noses, he has pictures, and he's a very serious guy. It's already happening. And let's remember what happened in Libya. So these are Muslim Brotherhood people. They will behave. You can imagine how they behave. I have to say that among my friends, colleagues, this is the single most controversial issue. Some people think I'm too outspoken against this. Clearly, if we had a choice of who would win, and probably I think eventually who will win, then I would prefer the rebels to win, especially now after Egypt. Because since Egypt has so weakened this possibility that there be a big Sunni Islamist bloc, rivaling on an equal level the Iranian bloc, although Iran's hopes in the Arab world are finished, they really are, that this gives an additional argument as to why the U.S. can support these people, because their winning would be less dangerous. Nevertheless, you want to give arms and money in the United States to people who are very possibly going to carry out mass murders among Christians and among Alawites. And my colleague, who's been in Syria 3 times, they've told him this, who are going to turn. I mean, one day you'll read a headline saying, 3,000 Alawites murdered with American weapons. Do you want to support people who will then subvert Jordan and go to war against Israel? And finally, do you want to have people who give arms to others? So it's just, I just don't see it personally.